I didn't intend for you to be that friendly. Just sort of nominally churchy friendly. Very proper. That was too much. I kid, of course. In addition to the opportunity that provided me to take my guitar off and put on the microphone and get everything set up, it's a reminder that as God's people, not only are we united to the Lord by faith, but we're also united to one another by faith, whether we like it or not. We're all, as children of God, by faith and grace. We are also brothers and sisters with one another, all part of the same family. So this was a good reminder for that. Turn, if you would, our text for this morning, James chapter 3. James chapter 3. Starting in verse 13. Since I'm coming in and parachuting in here just with this one message from the book of James, let me, while you're turning, let me give you just say a few things about the book and its author. James is written, as you might guess from the title of the book, by James, right? But there are a few Jameses in the Bible. So this one is not the brother of John, who is one of the 12. Rather, this is the one who's the half-brother of Jesus who writes this. James really doesn't get a lot of, there's not a whole lot going on with James in the gospel narratives themselves. He gets mentioned a few times in lists of Jesus' brothers. However, by the time we get to the book of Acts and into the early church, James, this guy who wrote this book, the half-brother of Jesus, half-brother because, well, Jesus is God, half-brother, this James becomes a leader in the early church. In fact, James, Peter, and Paul are often viewed as the kind of three pillars of the early church, the great leaders in the early church. Anyway, he's the fellow that writes this letter that we're going to look at just a very small sliver of here this morning from James chapter 3. Should be in your bulletin. Hopefully you also have Bibles open to James chapter 3, starting in verse 13. I'm going to read that for us, and then I'm going to pray, and we'll just talk for a few minutes. James chapter 3. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show it by his good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, of the devil. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure. It's peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, unwavering and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace raise a harvest of righteousness. Let's pray. Lord God, we come to you today to talk about wisdom, in particular the sort of wisdom that you can give us, that comes from you. Lord, as we discuss wisdom, I pray that you would give us hearts and minds that long to have more of it, that long to know you more and have more wisdom from you. Lord, I pray that even as we talk, your word would, in ways that perhaps we don't even understand, be applied to our hearts by your Spirit, that it would shape our minds the way we think and shape our hearts in the way that we feel, shape our will, the decisions that we make, and conform all of those things into the likeness of Jesus. God, I pray that your word would convict us, if necessary, that it would make us uncomfortable, make us squirm, but also that it would be an agent that would comfort us if that's what's needed. Lord Jesus, we love you. God, we thank you for your word, which is preserved for us. We pray these things in your name, Jesus. Amen. So wisdom. Wisdom is a character trait that is universally respected, I think, and universally desired, right? When a company is looking to hire a person for a position of leadership, they look for someone with wisdom, right? Someone who will make wise decisions on behalf of the company. When a problem occurs in the family, who's the person everyone turns to? It's the wise one, perhaps the elder statesman who has wisdom in his life and in his heart. Perhaps you can even think of a time when you have sought out someone who's wise to give you sage guidance for a particular situation going on in your life, in your world. Now, it's important to note right off the bat that wisdom is not the same thing as intelligence, as being smart. Someone can have a really high IQ, but not be wise. And similarly, someone can be very wise, but not score well on tests or have lots of degrees hanging on the wall. Wisdom and intelligence are related, but they're different things. Now, just as in the world, wisdom is a desirable trait, in the church, as Christians, we value wisdom as well. When King Solomon in the Old Testament can receive any gift from God, he asks for wisdom above all else and is praised for his excellent request. We have whole books of the Bible that speak and laud the value of wisdom, books like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes that are just all about wisdom and talking about how great and important wisdom is. In the Gospels, people from a very young age, people are just amazed by the wisdom that Jesus has. Jesus is a wise person, and people marvel at his wisdom. But is this the same kind of wisdom that everybody in the world wants? Does the Bible talk about wisdom any differently than the world at large? It's a question we'll come back to in a bit. In a bit later on, we'll focus actually on the text that's printed up in your bulletin that I just read from James chapter 3, verses 13 through 18. We'll look and focus in on that text as we talk about wisdom, true wisdom and also a false sort of wisdom. But first, I wanted to say a few things more generally about the book of James. It's an interesting book. This book, the book of James, has at different times in history made Protestant Christians really nervous. The reason? Well, one of the foundational core doctrines that we teach even today is that salvation, by that I mean a restored relationship with God, forgiveness of sins, eternal life, being a part of God's family, all that. So we teach that salvation comes by faith alone. You don't add anything onto, you don't have to do a list of things in order for God to love you and accept you and receive you. Salvation comes by faith alone. That's a thing we teach very strongly here in our church and that churches have taught over the centuries. Now, this makes us nervous because James says stuff like this. Ready? Faith without works is dead. Well, I thought it was faith plus nothing equals salvation. How does that... James says stuff like, you ready for another one? A person is justified by works and not faith alone. Now, if you're a Protestant Christian, that starts to make you itch. I thought it was just by faith and not by works. I thought that was the big thing. Why is James saying this? This has led many over history to be a bit nervous. Even great Protestant heroes like Martin Luther have suggested that perhaps it doesn't belong in the Bible at all. Saying things like other books, like Romans, are made of gold and silver, but James is like straw. Should we, along with all of these Protestants who've gotten itchy about James, be nervous as well? Is James somehow pushing an alternative method for achieving salvation? For James, is there a list of good deeds or some level of personal holiness or personal morality that must be achieved before God will let us into the family? Does James, in this regard, deviate from the rest of the New Testament? I suspect you know the answer is no. Of course not. You see, a more careful reading of James's letter and not just pulling those lines out of context. A more careful reading of James' letter reveals that he's not saying that doing certain things or acting in a certain way or being a certain kind of person achieves a relationship with God. That's not what he's saying. Rather, what he's saying is that when someone has a relationship with God, there are fundamental changes that take place. It's a relationship that by its very nature is transformative. A relationship with God is a relationship that by its very nature is transformative. And there is an expectation that if there is indeed a living relationship with God present, transformation will occur. Think of a flower seed or a plant seed of some sort. Once planted in the ground and watered, how do you know if that seed or that plant is alive? Something starts to pop up. You see a little sprout and then maybe a flower or some fruit or something like that. In the same way, if there's a living relationship with God present in a person's life, there's an expectation that the fruit of that changed life will start to pop up. And this is why James says, I will show you my faith by my works. Do you see that? He's not saying do these things to have a relationship with God. He's saying if you have a relationship with God, these are the sorts of changes that you should expect to see. Do you see the difference there? Very different thing. So what does all of this have to do with wisdom? You might be wondering. That's where we started in strong, wisdom. Well, I mentioned that by its nature, a relationship with God is transformative. It changes a person. And one of the things that changes is the way that you and I view the world. We start to see things through God's eyes more and more. We come to value the things that God values more and more. We look at other people the way that God looks at them and see them the way that God sees them. And we better understand our place in the world, our place in history, our place in our families, because we understand ourselves in light of the one who is Lord of all. You can say, in a sense, that our horizons are expanded. We see things from a bigger picture, a bigger perspective. By the way, this is my working definition of godly biblical wisdom. The capacity to perceive the world from God's perspective. The capacity to perceive the world from God's perspective. This is what godly wisdom is. Now, very briefly, I want to make sure to say that godly wisdom is something that we grow into. It's not as if someone downloads a file into our spiritual hard drive and we've got it. Wisdom downloaded and obtained. It's a progressive thing. The longer and more mature our relationship with God, the greater capacity we have to perceive the way that He does. Married folks know something similar to this, right? The longer you're with your spouse, the more time you spend with them, the more events that take place in your lives, the greater capacity you have to view the world through his or her eyes. You start to think about things the same way. You start to respond to things in similar manner. A similar sort of thing here is taking place with our relationship with God. The more time we spend with Him, the more He carries us along through life, the more mature our faith, the more we're able to see things the way He sees them. And we know this progressive nature of godly wisdom is true. We know that it's real because even in this letter of James, earlier on in James 1:5, James encourages his readers to ask God for greater degrees of wisdom. So there's an expectation that you can ask of it and receive more of it. Godly wisdom. Okay. All that being said, let's now focus in on our key text for today, the one that is printed for you in the bulletin, the one that I read, James chapter 3, starting in verse 13. Now, as we do that, our time will be divided between two questions. The rest of our time, two questions. One, what does false wisdom look like? What does false wisdom look like? And two, what happens when a person is permeated with godly wisdom? What happens when a person is permeated with godly wisdom? Let's talk about the first question first. What does false wisdom look like? Well, Several moments ago, I mentioned that wisdom is something that the world at large values. But if the wisdom the Bible talks about expressly comes from God, as verse 17 of our text says, is there another sort of wisdom out there? A counterfeit wisdom, if you will? A counterfeit wisdom masquerading as the real thing? Well, according to our text, there is indeed such a thing, such a false wisdom. Take a look at verse 15. Such wisdom, translation puts those nice sarcastic quotes in there for us. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, of the devil. The book of James teaches us that true wisdom comes from heaven, comes from God, the one who gives all good and perfect gifts. But there is another sort of wisdom out there. It finds its origin not in heavenly courts, but in worldly systems. It finds its origin not in the Spirit of God, but in that which is unspiritual. It's not from the Father, but from the devil. So what does this false wisdom look like? Well, look at the two verses bracketing the one I just read. First, beginning of 14, and then I'm going to read the beginning of 16. Verse 14, but if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, bitter envy, selfish ambition, and then again, beginning of verse 16, for where you have envy and selfish ambition. Did you catch those two defining key characteristics? Envy, selfish ambition. Envy and selfish ambition. These two things are the hallmarks of counterfeit wisdom. As some have pointed out, this sort of counterfeit wisdom has its own internal logic, and it goes like this. If true wisdom is the capacity to view the world from God's perspective, then counterfeit wisdom is viewing the world as if there were no God at all. Or perhaps even better described, viewing the world as if I myself am God. I am at the center of the universe, and it all revolves around me. And as a result, when I think that way, I'm consumed with envy for people that have something I don't, something that I want and think that I deserve. I begin to envy because I'm at the center of the universe, and I should get whatever I deserve. And I'm consumed with selfish ambition to obtain that which I want but don't have. I'm envious of people that have things that I deserve because I'm at the center of the universe, and because I'm at the center of the universe, I'm going to do whatever it takes to achieve my selfish ambitions. Now, we might think things like, I can't believe she's more popular than I am. I should be the popular one here. What can I do to gain everyone's love and respect? I can't believe they have been given more responsibility than I have at my workplace. I'm the smart one. I'm the one who should be in charge here. What can I do to take hold of that which is rightfully mine? They have something that belongs to me. What can I do to take hold of it? When the world revolves around me, everything I want is something that I deserve and something that I should get. And the thought process that gets me there is this counterfeit wisdom. It says, you're at the center of the universe. You get what you deserve. You get what's yours. Do whatever it takes. If there is no God, there is some appearance of wisdom here, right? I've got to look out for myself. If I don't believe that there's a God who's on my side, if I don't believe there's a God who has loved me to the uttermost in Christ Jesus, and if I don't believe there's a God who will continue to guard the steps of my life, then I've got to take control of my own happiness and my own well-being. Just me, number one. I'm in charge, and the world revolves around me, so I'm going to take control of my destiny. But there is a God. And the passage goes on in verse 16 to describe what happens when people are controlled by the so-called wisdom of envy and selfish ambition. Take a look at verse 16 again. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder in every evil practice. You know this is true from experience. When everybody's primary concern is self, and everybody sees the universe as revolving around me, chaos and disorder ensues as nobody's trying to find solutions that will be helpful and serving others. But what serves me? And every evil practice is abundant as people are cutthroat in attempts to get whatever they possibly can get, to get whatever they want. They'll climb on whoever they have to climb on. Think, for example, perhaps a bit more lighthearted of an illustration. Think, for example, about a room full of small children who are all interested in the same toy. I've seen this play before a few different times. Disorder and every evil practice ensue, right? The room breaks into chaos. Children are shouting at each other. They're screaming. They're throwing tantrums. They're grabbing at the desired toy. They're pushing each other. They're hitting. They're pulling hair. They're clawing. Everything, as envy and selfish ambition has taken hold inside each and every little heart. Now, the only difference with children is that they're not very good at hiding their envy and selfish ambition. As adults, we do the same thing. We're just more crafty and devious about it. When a new position opens up at work, when someone receives an honor that should have belonged to me, when we don't get what we want, that we think we deserve, we throw tantrums too. They're just silently raging inside, eating us up. We seek to strike blows as well. We just do it through gossip and slander and lies and deception. As one commentator observes, when we're controlled by the false wisdom of envy and selfish ambition, we don't weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice, as Jesus instructs us. Instead, we rejoice when others weep, and we weep when others rejoice. This is the counterfeit wisdom the world offers. There is no God, you are God, and the world revolves around you. You deserve whatever you want. Do whatever it takes to get there. False wisdom, in a moment of honesty here, false wisdom is easy to get caught in, right? In fact, I suspect most of us have dealt with it very recently, if not even today. False wisdom is subtle. Its lies are appealing. You can get what you want, just grab a hold of it. And as we have said, it presents an appearance of reasonableness. Friends, know that it leads to destruction. Individually, it eats us up inside, and it leads to destruction with relationships that we have with others as well. And ultimately, at its very core, it's a denial of the trustworthiness of God. Because we're saying, well, I don't trust you, God. I don't trust that there's a God out there who's got my best interest in heart. So I'm going to take control of my own destiny. Okay, enough about the false wisdom. Kind of a downer. Let's talk about the real thing, huh? What happens when a person is permeated with godly wisdom? Now remember our definition for godly wisdom. It's the ability to view the world with God's perspective. And remember, it's a progressive sort of thing. It's a gift that God gives us when we ask Him, and it's something that grows in us as we are transformed by our relationship with Him. Godly wisdom. Now, what happens when this godly wisdom starts to take hold and show fruit in our lives? Well, by its very nature, it changes the way that we live. Take a look at verse 13. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show it by his good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. Some translations have, let him show it by his good conduct, life. Remember, godly wisdom is something that's transformative, and it leads to a changed life. Now, notice, James isn't giving a list of rules. He doesn't say, here's how you know if you're a wise person. You do these things. You don't do those things. He doesn't say that at all. He says, you know you are a wise person when you lead a good, or I like even better translation, a beautiful life. It's not just a list of do's and don'ts, but it's rather a way of life. It's a description of the way that we live in trusting God and live in obedience to Him. that we lean into that relationship in such a way that we follow Him. And we do it not because we have to, and we do it not because we feel like we owe God something or are paying off a debt. We live this good life, we live by good conduct because of the wisdom. Because godly wisdom says, remember, we're seeing things from God's perspective. And so no longer is obedience to God and His commandments, no longer is it a laborious, awful thing that I have to do. Because when I see things from God's perspective, I realize that His commands for my life are good. And like a parent with a child, He has my best interests in heart, even when I can't always tell it. And He wants the best for me. That's what happens when godly wisdom takes hold. It changes our lives. The way that we live our lives becomes good and beautiful because we're following God and we see that it's good. And then there's a list of characteristics that James outlines in verse 17. Take a look there now. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure. It's peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, unwavering or impartial, depending upon your translation, and sincere. This section begins with the heading that heavenly wisdom leads to all purity. All purity. In other words, kind of morally pure or holy like God. Godly wisdom leads to God's people being more holy like God. There's a transformation that takes place as we become more like Jesus, right? There's a transformation that leads to purity. And this idea of purity is something of an umbrella category for all the rest of the stuff that James is going to say. It's a heading. Now, it would be a worthwhile endeavor to unpack each of these terms, each of these words on its own, but we don't have time for that. So we'll look at them in three groups of characteristics and speak about how each group is related to godly wisdom. Three groups of characteristics, how each is related to godly wisdom. The first group, the wisdom that comes from heaven, is peace-loving, considerate, and submissive. Peace-loving, considerate, and submissive. That's the first group. And this first group is in direct contrast to the envy and selfish ambition that defines the counterfeit wisdom. Instead of disorder, godly wisdom loves peace and seeks to promote it. Instead of prioritizing self above all else, godly wisdom is considerate and submissive of self in humility to the needs and wants of others. To borrow words from Philippians chapter 2, godly wisdom looks not to your own interest, but to the interest of others, even as Jesus Himself did in dying for His people. Godly wisdom is, in this way, self-sacrificial. Godly wisdom leads to this characteristic because a person who is truly wise and sees things from God's perspective knows that I am not the center of the universe, but God is the center of the universe. Jesus is the one who plays the leading role in history. And even still, He has set an example of self-sacrifice for us. Furthermore, seeing human relationships from God's perspective shows us that when everybody is looking out for self, chaos and backstabbing reigns supreme. On the other hand, when people are thinking first of one another, everybody's needs are met. If I'm not primarily concerned with me, but all of you, and all of you are primarily concerned not of yourself, but of everybody else, you can see how everybody's needs get met as we love one another and serve one another well. Godly wisdom shows that this is a very wonderful and practical thing. Finally, so second category here. Full of mercy and good fruit. Full of mercy and good fruit. So the first collection of characteristics, peace-loving, considerate, submissive. The second, full of mercy and good fruit. Mercy is showing kindness to a person or a group of people who haven't done anything to inherently deserve that kindness. Showing kindness to a person or group of people who haven't done anything to deserve that kindness. You can maybe think of a time that you have shown mercy to a person, or perhaps a time when you have been shown mercy. In the Old Testament, God describes himself on numerous occasions, and almost every time he plugs in a word like merciful in describing himself. He's a God who is full of mercy, a God who is compassionate. God describes himself as merciful. And in the gospel, people in needs of healing and help always come to Jesus and cry out for him to show them mercy. Son of David, have mercy on us. And he does. He looks out over the crowds of people and has compassion and mercy on them. They're like sheep without a shepherd, he says. And when we have godly wisdom, we start to look at the world more and more through God's eyes. And we see people the way that God sees them. We see people as not objects to be used or obstacles to get around or perhaps useful for a while, but maybe not so useful anymore. We don't see people that way. We see people as sick people in need of a doctor. We see people as lost sheep in need of a shepherd. We see people as orphans, spiritually speaking, in need of being part of God's family. When we have this sort of perspective, we too show mercy just like Jesus does. Godly wisdom leads us there. Finally, the last grouping. Unwavering and sincere. Unwavering and sincere. You may have noticed the version printed in your bulletin, the ESV, which is a wonderful translation, translates that first word as impartial. Impartial. It's a possible translation, and there's some overlap between impartial and unwavering. Both are possible translations from the Greek word, but I think, given the context, both here and then in the next chapter of James, I like unwavering better because I think it sends a clearer message as to what's going on here. This pair of characteristics, unwavering and sincere, describe a sort of devotion to the Lord, a kind of devotion to the Lord. It's the real faith of a saint that has been through much walking with God, has been through many events, and has seen God act on their behalf, and has come to trust God in such a way that they're confident in their relationship with Him, they're confident in their standing. This is a person who is not tossed about by every up and down of life. See, when we have godly wisdom, we perceive the world from God's perspective. And when we do this, we know that He's got it all under control. We don't have to worry about all the ups and downs of the daily life, because we rest in the promise that our God, who is in control of all things, as Romans 8:28 says, is working together all things for the good of those who love Him. When we know that, when we see that and believe it, we're unwavering, we're sincere with our faith, because we've trusted in God. That list of characteristics we just spoke about are the sorts of things that we should expect as the fruit of godly wisdom in our lives. This is the sort of wisdom that the Bible exalts. It's the sort of wisdom we should ask God for more of. We should invest ourselves in our relationship with the Lord so that we can become more wise and we can start to exhibit these categories and have our lives transformed. To finish up here, our passage discusses two types of wisdom. The first is a counterfeit wisdom masquerading as the real thing. It is defined by envy and selfish ambition. It proclaims that there is no God and tells each of us that we are the center of the universe. It's appealing, attractive, perhaps even temporarily pleasurable. But we must reject it as it is a destructive lie leading to disorder and evil. The second kind of wisdom, however, is the real thing, the real deal, godly wisdom. Godly wisdom is a gift from God that grows and matures. It's the capacity to see the world the way that God sees it, and it's the capacity to be transformed by this new perspective. Godly wisdom leads to a good and a beautiful life, a life of trusting God and leaning into obedience, because it's a good thing. Seek after God and seek after His wisdom. Let's pray.